showcase all the new weapons that are out there. And what had been happening pre-1914 in Europe was the countries had been having an arms race in Europe. There were two very big alliances that pretty much divided Europe in two, at least two power bases or power spheres. These two grand alliances were the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. The Triple Entente was an alliance between Great Britain, France, and Russia, and later, eventually, Italy. The Triple Alliance was Germany, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Turkey Ottoman Empire, sometimes Italy. And the Triple Entente, I want you all to be very careful here, were nicknamed the Allies. So when I talk about the Allies, I am referring to the Triple Entente. Don't get confused that the Triple Alliance, some people say, oh, they are the Allies. No, because of alliance. It's the Triple Entente that are called the Allies. What had happened in Europe is that these two alliances, kind of power spheres, if you want to think about it, had basically divided the world between them. These are imperial powers. They have colonies around the world. They've divided the world. They divided Europe between these two alliances. And all these countries have been having arms races. As one country got a new weapon, the other country got the same weapon. And it's been keeping everything kind of escalating. You add to all of this the fact that you have very long, intense, traditional rivalries in these alliances. The alliances are, you have Great Britain, the division of the rivalries is between Great Britain and Germany. And what is the big issue here between Great Britain and Germany? It is really something that they have been fighting for centuries: control of the seas. Great Britain traditionally was the naval power of the world. They had the strongest navy. They were considered the most powerful country in the world. And in essence, Germany wanted a little bit of that action. There was also the rivalry for colonies, colonial power. In Africa, in Asia, again, Germany kind of wanted what the British had. You add to that a history and a tradition in many of these countries. For example, Germany had a very long-standing military tradition, a military culture, a culture very accustomed to the power of the military. They were led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was kind of like a military king. Ironically, Kaiser Wilhelm II is a cousin of the British royal family. You also had the tradition in Great Britain of a very powerful navy. They had had the most powerful navy pretty much since the 1700s, really the 1600s. It's just a lot of things that have just been added constantly every year to this rivalry between Great Britain and Germany. And in the middle of all this, you have kind of an X factor, so to speak. In the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, what you had were a lot of groups of people that wanted their own self-determination. They wanted freedom from these empires, particularly, for example, in Eastern Europe, in what was known as the Yugoslavian region. You had the Serbians, who had long time been wanting their own self-determination, their own nation. They wanted to get rid of the Austrian control. So you have what we call patriotism, all for not only self-determination of some ethnic groups, but patriotism for the big countries like the British and the French and the Germans. All of this is going to ignite when, on the 28th of June, 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, is assassinated. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is killed by a Serbian nationalist. So this is, when you look at it, a domestic issue for the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. This is a Serbian nationalist who lives within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, who wants freedom for his Serbian people from this empire. And they assassinate Franz Ferdinand, or he assassinates Franz Ferdinand when Franz Ferdinand is visiting Sarajevo, Yugoslavia. For all practical purposes, this is pretty much something that you would just kind of think, well, why isn't the Austrian-Hungarian people, this empire, dealing with it? Why does it become a World War I? Well, what happens is, because of these alliances, because of these escalation of arms or an arms race, and because of all the things that have been happening prior to this, everything escalates very quickly. It's almost like somebody took a match to a bonfire that has gasoline all around it. It's just going to ignite. So what happens? The Austrian-Hungarian military, based out of Austria and Vienna, is going to send their military down to Sarajevo. They want to attack the Serbs. They want to punish them for this. The Serbs, who are down in geographically southeastern Europe, are then appealing to the Russians, who are very close to their border, for help. The Russians mobilize, not necessarily helping them, but they mobilize to their western border. As they do this, the Germans are mobilizing their army. Remember, the Germans are allies with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. The Germans are going to mobilize their army to the German-Belgium border, which is southwest of Germany. As Germany does this, France mobilizes their military to the French-Belgium border to protect the French border in case Germany advances into Belgium. In the meantime, Britain declares any kind of movement on Germany, they will declare war on Germany to protect France. Germany says they are doing all their movement simply because they are going to get the back of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, because they see what the Russians is doing as a threat. Well, what does Germany do? They will invade Belgium. And when they do, there is a big old domino effect. All the alliances come into play, and you end up with World War I. By 1915, you have two theaters or two fronts in World War I. There is the Western Front and the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front has to do with Germany making an advance or an attack on Russia. They are saying Russia was planning an attack on Europe, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and on Germany. So they have attacked Germany first. And so you have the Eastern Front. This advancement of German troops into Russia is slow because of the very cold winter of Russia. It's very difficult to advance into Russia because of the weather. And the Russians are going to be using sharpshooters to stop the German forces, but the Germans are advancing. On the Western Front, which is in Western Europe, you're going to have the main part of this being fought between the French and German lands, Belgium and the French and German borders. What's going to emerge on the Western Front is a stalemate because of the arms race. Everybody had similar arms, similar weapons, similar power. And the Allies, the British and the French, are at a stalemate. They can't advance against the Germans, and the Germans can't advance against them. And you end up with a strip of land that was called no man's land. Neither side was passing this no man's land. It was a stalemate. It's about a 60-mile wide zone of land between France and Germany that nobody was advancing. And it almost seems like it's a standstill. It doesn't mean that they're not fighting. They are constantly fighting. The land in no man's land is complete destruction and many casualties, but there is no advancement. And what you see developing on the Western Front in this no man's land is very, very dangerous trench warfare. Basically, both sides are entrenching themselves. And what that means is they are building tunnels, a maze in the lands of tunnels on each side, and they are living in these canals. And they pop out, they attack, they have to go through barbed wire, which they are using to protect their trenches from the enemy. And that's how they get up and they fight. The other side shoots them down. The other side gets up and they fight, and the other side shoots them down. There's no advancement. These trenches were created because of the new technology in tanks. The idea was that as the tanks crossed no man's land, they would land in these canals and would get entrenched, get stuck. But there's no advancement. All it is casualties, death, destruction, and no movement. We are hearing about all this. We are hearing about this trench warfare, and our newspapers are publishing it. But Wilson and the American people are really trying to remain neutral. But that neutrality is very difficult to keep. We have a very large immigrant population with ties to Europe. The Irish, the English that are 1-2 generations removed from Europe, they are not allying themselves, but they favor, obviously, the Allies. The German immigrants obviously tended to favor the Germans. And then you had a very long history and tradition of the United States. We were an old British colony, and we had long ties with Great Britain. We also had very long ties and very established ties with France. They had been our first ally. They had been our ally in the War of Independence. They had been the first country to recognize our independence. They had lent us Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, who was Washington's greatest confidant and military ally. That history and tradition really pushed a lot of people to favor the Allies, the Triple Entente. You also add business, commercial ties. We had a lot of trade with Great Britain and France. Great Britain was one of our biggest trading partners, but we also traded with Germany. So, I mean, things sometimes seem very clear-cut. The majority of the people probably favored, from the beginning, the Triple Entente, or the Allies, the British and the French. But, I mean, there were some that favored the Germans. But the newspapers are really going to start changing, even those pro-German sentiments in the United States, because they start reporting a lot of the German war tactics, particularly a lot of the new strategies that the Germans were using. The British had blockaded all of Germany, the ports. Germany has a very small sea coast, and the British had been very successful at blockading this sea coast. So the Germans had developed a new warfare. They had a new weapon, the Unterseeboot. And for those of you all that don't speak German, Unterseeboot means underwater boat, submarine. What the Germans have adopted is U-boat warfare, as it was called. Now, yes, submarines had been developed prior to World War I, but it is the Germans that are the first to really use submarines as a war, as a war weapon. And they really were the first to have a fleet of submarines. The other countries really didn't have submarines to use in this kind of warfare. The other thing about the German U-boats, because submarines were new, the Allies had no way to defend against a submarine. They had no radar. They had no way of knowing when submarines were underwater. There was no way. So when Germany is using their submarine to attack, there is really no way to protect yourself against the U-boat. This is a new strategy, a new type of warfare, and the Germans are doing unrestricted U-boat warfare, which means they are attacking unlimited, unrestricted wartime boats, merchant boats. They are attacking private boats, anything that they feel is a threat to their security. Now, the idea is they are going to attack only the Allied boats. They're going to attack the French boats, the English boats. They're not going to attack American ships. And we're not attacking American ships. But they do advise to the Americans and to other countries that are trying to remain neutral, don't ride on Allied boats. Don't ride on French boats. Don't ride on British boats, even if they are private passenger liners. Don't ride on them because we are in war against England and France. In 1915, what the Germans do to a private passenger liner, this is a sea cruiser, okay? It's a private English vessel, shocks the world and shocks the United States in particular. They will torpedo the Lusitania, a British passenger liner in which 1,198 civilians died. 128 of those that died were American passengers. Wilson declares openly, this is unwarranted. You do not attack civilians. You can be in war. You can attack all the military boats you want and military ships, and fine, but you don't attack cruise liners. The Germans said we had to. The Lusitania was carrying weapons in its cargo areas. Wilson goes, it doesn't matter. This is a private ship. You don't do this. So Germany says, look, we're sorry, but don't ride British boats. This is war. Don't ride British ships. Americans, don't ride French ships. Interestingly enough, the Lusitania was on a secret mission. It did have weapons in its cargo area going to British ports. On August 1915, Germany attacks again. The Arabic, this is another private ocean liner, and a lot of civilian life is lost. Wilson again makes a declaration to the Germans, says you need to start protecting these passenger vessels. You cannot be attacking private vessels. These are civilians, and you must start paying for the losses. This is wrong. So the Germans offer the Arabic Pledge, which basically is that they will not be attacking private vessels. But in March 1916, Germany states that if they see any kind of merchant shipped arm, they will attack. And actually, they say we're going back to unrestricted submarine warfare. We are going to attack any of our enemies, that boats, private or military, if we feel they are hurting our security, if we feel they have arms or are a threat to us in the war. So don't ride French or British boats. Well, the Germans attack the Sussex. This is a private boat, a French ferry. And this is an actual photograph of the Sussex, the damage that a torpedo did to it. And Wilson is like, this is it. I threatened to end all German and U.S. relations. And so Germany says, okay, hold on. Just wait. We promise that we're going to try not to target passenger ships, and we'll only shoot merchant ships if we think they're armed or if they have weapons. But you know what we're going to do? We are going to send warning shots over the bow of these ships that we understand might be private, they might be merchant ships. If we think they are a threat to us, we're going to send them a warning shot over their bow, over them, and that way that would allow them to disembark the passengers. Nobody will get hurt. This is the Sussex Pledge, May 1916. Well, that same year is a presidential election year, and Wilson is running for re-election. his campaign slogan, "He kept us out of the war." And so that was in hopes that people would think this was a good thing he was doing, neutrality. And actually, at the Democrat convention, where he gets the nomination or the renomination as the Democrat nominee, Wilson actually does state, "We will not enter World War I." Wilson really hoped, if anything, this was going to be key in getting the women's vote. Remember, women could vote out west in some of these western states. And in fact, it did win and secure the women's vote. Wilson, though, was criticized by some Americans as being a coward. They said he kept us out of the war because he's a coward. Others said, well, he's just trying to do what's best for the US. Others said he had already been preparing for war and that he was outright lying. Well, actually, Wilson had been preparing for the war in 1915. He had asked Congress for money to start spending on the Army and the Navy. Wilson said, just in case, I will keep us out of the war, but just in case, we need to start preparing. So what happens? Well, Wilson does win the election in 1916, a big part because of the women's vote out west. But this re-election was very hard fought for Wilson. So it shows that Wilson was kind of on a very thin line with the American people. In 1917, as Wilson begins his second term as president, the British intelligence gives us a shocking thing they have uncovered. It is known as the Zimmermann Note. The Zimmermann Note is presented to Wilson on February 1917. Author Zimmermann was a German minister who was sending a telegram, was making a proposal to the Mexican government. This note is also, and I want to put it in context, arriving to the White House, arriving to Wilson by the British, while American intelligence is also telling Wilson, we are seeing warships off the coast of Mexico. We are seeing German planes in Mexico City. Something is happening. Remember, we even talked about German warships being off the coast of Veracruz in 1915. Something is happening. We are very aware that something is happening. Why are all these Germans in Mexico? What is the Zimmermann Note? Well, what the Zimmermann Note stated was that Germany made a proposal to Mexico. Germany wanted a possible alliance with Mexico where they would encourage Mexico to fight for the lands they have lost, the Mexican cession, the lands they lost to the U.S. in the U.S.-Mexico War. They thought that Mexico should recover those lands. Those were Mexican lands. And the Germans would help the Mexicans have their back by providing tanks and air power and guns and things that the Mexicans may need to do this. Basically, the Germans are saying, attack the U.S. Why are the Germans so interested in a possible Mexican attack of the U.S., this possible German-Mexican alliance? Why? Well, if you think about it, if the Mexican army, if Mexico attacked the U.S. down on the border, it would mean the U.S. would have to shift their focus down onto their southern border. They would have their own fight, their own war to deal with. It eliminates any possible involvement of the Americans in World War I. That was the crutch, the whole point of the Zimmermann Note, to eliminate American involvement in World War I. Now, did Mexico ever take seriously this possible German-Mexican alliance? No, there was no evidence that Mexico ever even deliberated it. It wasn't anything that was really on the radar for Mexico, but it did scare Americans and it did scare Wilson, this possible German-Mexican alliance. You add to this that Germany begins unlimited U-boat warfare again. Wilson then orders US merchant ships to be armed. And our military, our Navy, is ordered that they can attack if they are attacked. We are at the brink of war against Germany. On March 12th, March 21st, Germany will sink 5 US merchant ships. And on April 6, 1917, the United States officially declares war on Germany. Remember, the president may be the commander-in-chief in charge of all the military, but it is Congress that declares war. And is a great example of that separation of powers in our US Constitution. Well, the US getting into World War I was a great news for the Allies because obviously we were going to be fighting with Great Britain and France. We would be joining the Triple Entente, the Allies. There had been a stalemate for years on that Western Front. And so the added manpower, the added energy, the added alliance, the added help of the Americans was greatly needed. It was kind of, for the Europeans, for the French and the British, considered a game changer. And then something very shocking happens in November of 1917. The Russians are out. They leave the war. During the Russian involvement of World War I, there was something else happening domestically in Russia. There was a revolution, a communist revolution happening. It was the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks are a faction within the communist ideology, and the Bolsheviks were led by Vladimir Lenin, an avowed communist. And the Bolshevik Revolution was successful. They actually killed all of the Tsar's family and the Tsar himself. And Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks will establish the first ever communist regime of a country. They eliminate, Russia no longer exists. There is no more Russia. It is dead. There is only now the United Soviet Socialist Republic, or the Soviet Union, the USSR. Well, Lenin, representing the Soviet Union, will go into a secret treaty with the Germans. It's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And basically, Vladimir Lenin is like, the Soviet Union has no dog in this bone. We are not involved in this. This was something that the Tsars, old Russia, was involved in. And so we are ending this war with you. Germany, no longer attack us. We will no longer attack you. The end. Out. And so November 1917, the Eastern Front is closed. And that means all those German forces would now be moving to the Western Front. So with even more reason were the Allies extremely happy about the American involvement. Now, back to the US, mobilizing for war. As soon as we declared war on Germany, May 1917, we passed the Selective Service Act, which is basically the draft. On August 1917, we start sending our first troops to France, to Europe, to start fighting the war. These American troops going to World War I were led by General Pershing, same guy that was after Pancho Villa. The American troops are going to be known as the American Expeditionary Force. Now, one thing I really want you all to kind of just remember, especially when we go into World War II, the Allies, the British, the French, the Americans, the Italians now are involved in it. What we're going to see about the Allies is that the different forces, the British, the French, the Americans, they never worked as one unit. There was never one commander over all the Allied forces. Each country kept their own leader. So General Pershing was in charge of the American forces, the AEF, American Expeditionary Force. The English had their leaders. The French had their leaders. They might talk and coordinate, but there was always a disjointedness, okay? It'll be very different in World War II. Just spoiler alert for the future. Anyway, back to World War I and the AEF arriving in France. we arrived, and here we have the American troops arriving in Paris, going down the Champs-Élysées, the most famous avenue of Paris. And they had khaki uniforms. It doesn't look that way because of the black and white photograph and the shadows. But the Americans arrive, and one of the things that they are actually shouting as they are marching into Paris was "For Lafayette, for Lafayette." It was a way of recalling our long history with France. It was saying we are here to repay the debt of the Marquis de Lafayette, Washington's right-hand man in the War of Independence, and to repay the debt the French had. We have, I should say, with the French because of the War of Independence and the help the French gave us in that war and in helping us emerge as an independent nation. The French are like, yay, thank you, we're glad you're here. But it's really kind of funny that the French actually come up with their own nickname of the American Expeditionary Force. They're going to call the Americans the Doughboys. It's kind of funny, I guess. The Americans thought it was kind of funny. I don't know if it was actually meant to be more of an insult. But I want you to imagine you're in France, you've been fighting a war since 1914, you have had food rations, you have had hunger, you have had death and destruction and lands and casualties and chemical warfare. I mean, you've had all kinds of stuff happen, and more than anything, you're nice and hungry because there's not a lot of food. And you have these Americans arrive. Many of them just off the farms from the Midwest, all kind of healthy looking, or you might say maybe plumper, because they've had good healthy diets. The French are looking at them going, wow, they look like Pillsbury Doughboys in their little khaki uniforms. And just to make matters worse, the Americans were given this bread that they were supposed to eat in the army, part of the army supplies. It's kind of like a dough. It was in this kind of pop-up can, and you pop open the lid, and this doughy biscuit would come out. And so for the French, it was like, oh my God, the doughboys are eating dough. Like, can it be even more funny? But okay, that was their kind of attack on our guys, but they were very grateful for the energy that the American troops did bring. Now, although our AEF starts arriving in August of 1917, we really don't see big numbers until early 1918. Ironically, the war will end late 1918, November 1918. So you can say our involvement in World War I was actually very short. But the fact that it was short doesn't mean that it wasn't intense. The US troops fought with great distinction. They fought hard. They were involved in some very key battles towards the end of the war. They even participated in October that same year, 1918, in invading Germany, and were very key in that invasion in Germany. It was a very hard war, and the Americans were very key in breaking that stalemate. But on November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m., all fighting stopped. As they say, all went quiet on the Western Front. An armistice was agreed to. An armistice simply means ceasefire, no more fighting. Doesn't mean peace treaty. A peace treaty still had to be knocked out, but this just means we're not fighting, physically fighting, although technically we are still at war. November 11th, 1918 is still held with great regard in Europe. They celebrate Armistice Day, and in the United States, remember it as Veterans Day. But although our involvement in the war was short, it was also shocking to us. Our soldiers, what was the last experience we had of war? For many of our soldiers going to Europe, they hadn't even been in a war. But for those that had, the last one would have been in the Spanish-American War. And that war was, as we said, short and sweet. If war can be sweet, it was quick. We had very low casualties, and it was a victory. But what our soldiers saw, especially our young men who had never participated in war, was destruction, chaos, death. I mean, these are actual images from World War I of our American soldiers. We were shocked. The weaponry used, the strategies, chemical warfare, mustard gas, the fear of air power, trench warfare, these automatic machine guns. Here you can see them with their masks also on. I mean, this mobilization, and I want you all to see here, they're using horse soldiers. Here's a horse. This is the last war we will ever see horse soldiers or cavalry fighting. Why? The destruction, the brutality of World War I, not only was it horrid to American sensibility, I mean, to human sensibilities, we realized that animals, I mean, there was no surviving for animals in this kind of war. World War I was really one of the bloodiest wars in world history. It was bloody because of all these new weapons and the fact that both sides seemed to have the same weapons. Arms race that had happened before had created this bloody war. The new techniques, the trench warfare, the submarines, U-boat warfare. I mean, it brought war to a new level. Tanks. To get the tanks stuck, you now had trench warfare. You had artillery throwers. You had flamethrowers. I mean, burning everything around you with a flamethrower. Grenades, air warfare, rifles with telescopic sights, snipers, machine guns, and chemical warfare. There had never been a war like this. World War I was the war to end all wars. And our American soldiers who come in, you might say, fresh off the farms, idealistic, thinking, oh, this is going to be like the Spanish-American War. They're shocked. I'm always, as a horse lover and a rider of horses, this particular photo always strikes me as really telling. You have the humans, the soldiers in their gas masks, and an attempt to put a gas mask on a horse. The devastation. Back on the home front, the U.S. has to mobilize for war. And in essence, when we say mobilizing the home front for war, it's keeping the factories going so that they can provide things for the army and the people at home, keeping the home fires burning, as they say. We need to take care of the boys far away. We need to take care of ourselves at home, and we need to keep everything going. And yet the majority of our workforce, these soldiers, are now fighting far away. So you need to keep everything on the home front going. I do want you all to know that war is very big business. There is a lot of money to be made in war, mainly because of government contracts. You are supplying a war effort. It's big money. Keep that in mind when we talk about the Great Depression. Anyway, what do we see mobilizing on the home front? We're going to have a food administration put together, led by Herbert Hoover, who will eventually become a president in the 1920s. The food administration is going to be in charge of setting farm prices, and they're going to actually set farm prices very high. The idea was to encourage farmers to increase their production. Why do you want the production increased? Because you want to keep supplying the army with food. Farmers are actually going to see a rise in their income by 30%. People are encouraged to save their food, conserve it, really save it for the army. And so we're going to see the encouragement of sacrifice on the home front. Days promoted like Mondays and Wednesdays, we don't eat wheat, no bread, because the idea is that that wheat, that bread is going to go to a soldier fighting the war. So wheatless Mondays and Wednesdays, or meatless Tuesdays. Again, same idea. Don't eat meat on Tuesdays because that meat that we save will be going to a soldier fighting the war. Interesting, we will export our food not only to the American soldiers in Europe, but to the Allies in World War I and have no shortages at home. The War Industries Board, WIB, will be in charge of controlling all aspects of the industrial production. And Bernard Baruch will be in charge of that. And he was a businessman. So business people trusted him. They didn't feel that he was going to take advantage of this position, because what the WIB is going to do is actually allocate who is getting the raw resources, who's going to get the iron ore to produce steel, etc. He is going to issue standardization of products and fix prices of products, as well as grant exemptions from antitrust laws. So it was scary if somebody was just doing this, but the idea that this is for the war effort, people trusted Baruch and they were willing to submit to this if it was for the war. Actually, profits will increase because of this. We have other things happening. Government is starting to pass laws that will impede, encroach upon certain civil liberties. In 1917, you have the Espionage Act, which basically said you got a 20-year prison term and a $10,000 fine if you were convicted of aiding the enemy. I mean, that makes sense in a wartime. But it also says if you disrupt the draft, which means no protesting against the draft. There is the Sedition Act passed early 1918, which made it illegal to print, write, publish any disloyal, profane, or abusive language about the government, about the American flag, or about the uniform. So they're basically controlling some of the freedom of speech here. The Committee on Public Information, or the CPI, was in charge of propaganda, getting the home front to buy into the war, so to speak. And so what they're going to do is promote propaganda, war propaganda. What they're basically going to be doing is pamphlets and speeches and posters, basically saying that the war was a crusade for democracy. Germany was evil. They had been warmongering. They had started the war, and they will exaggerate German atrocities. All of this is so that the people really do get on board for the war. Hollywood gets involved in the war. You're going to start seeing a lot of movies. Really, actually, it begun around 1914 when World War I had started, where the villain, the bad guy, was always German, or the Kaiser himself, or Germans were all evil. It shows the power of Hollywood, because people actually listened more to the Hollywood movies than they did the Committee of Public Information. There's a lot of propaganda against drinking. It becomes very patriotic to not drink, to be sober, to save yourself for the war effort. Besides the fact, Germans were kind of traditionally the founders or inventors of beer. It was said, and if you drank beer and you drank, then you were being German, and so don't drink. Big support for prohibition arises out of this patriotic propaganda. Anheuser-Busch, which is one of the largest breweries at the time, had a lot of difficulty during this time period. In fact, they had to change their name because people associated Anheuser-Busch, which is actually German names, with the war and the evil Germans. There's a lot of anti-German sentiment. People are attacking German immigrants on the streets. They are firing from jobs anybody that has a German name. I'm not liking the Germans very much. Governments are also regulating fuel, transportation, and labor. The Fuel Administration is rationing who gets the coal, who gets the oil, and they tried to conserve it for the army by making the whole country go under daylight savings time. The Railroad Administration is centralizing prices of railroads and controlling railroad workers' wages. The National War Labor Board is setting kind of a concise policy for all labor workers around the country, controlling their wages, controlling their hours, encouraging collective bargaining and unionization. However, they are saying no strikes. Now, they're not forbidding strikes. They're simply saying, if you strike, we're going to let you unionize. We're going to let you bargain for things as a group, but no strikes. Strikes are unpatriotic. It hurts the war effort. Felix Frankfurter is in charge of the WAB, or the War Labor Board. And again, I just want you all to understand, he's saying, yes, you can have unions, but just don't strike. And what's interesting is that we're seeing a lot of women work in these factories. Women are taking up the job vacancies. They're keeping the industry, the factories, the farms going as the soldiers are out there fighting the war. We will see other groups, African Americans, Mexican Americans taking up the slack also in these factories. But women, what we're seeing is something that will be really big in World War II. Women keeping that home front going, jobs in factories, keeping the families united and going while the fathers or the men are out fighting the war. It's very patriotic for these women to keep the home front going. And these new opportunities, these new jobs, these new responsibilities is giving women a lot more confidence. Speaking of African Americans and Mexican Americans, what we're seeing, for example, in the African American community is a lot of recruitment from African Americans in the South, encouraging them to move the North. Again, this coincides with the Great Migration to the North. Why are they encouraging African Americans to go to the North? Well, they need labor. They need people to take up these jobs in the factories. But as African Americans do move north, remember the racial tensions will increase in the North, the Midwest, where they go, the competition for jobs, housing, and prejudice all increases racial tensions. As far as Mexican Americans, I am now going to start where we're actually talking about Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans. Why? Because we are seeing a large amount of Mexican immigration, the revolution in Mexico. They see the US with all these job openings because of the war effort as an opportunity. And in fact, the US government is going to relax immigration restrictions because they need the labor. And you will see many Mexicans coming that will find jobs and openings in agriculture, particularly in the Southwest, from Texas to California, in farming and ranching. But what's really interesting is that you're now also seeing many of these that are coming from Mexico, not only finding opportunities in the Southwest, but finding jobs in factories in the big urban centers in the North. Chicago will be a big area where we will start seeing a large Mexican immigrant population. They're going for the jobs in these factories. And what do we see a rise in Chicago? Kind of similar to what we saw when we had the Italian waves and the Irish waves and the Russian waves of immigration, the different communities, Little Italies, Chinatowns, etc. You now start getting Mexican barrios in the middle of Chicago, urban barrios in these big towns up north. On the home front, things had changed. More people had economic opportunities. It had changed. For example, women had given them a different taste, a different life, I should say, a little more confidence about what could possibly be open to them. And our view of the government had changed. We saw the government as a little more involved in what we did in our lives, not just the laws up here, but more involved in actual things that affect us day to day. But when the soldiers begin to return, what we're going to see is, wait a minute, they want their jobs back. And they start getting their jobs back, and just a little bit of a, oh, wait, clash. Another thing we see when our soldiers come back is that some of them just can't adapt to being back home. Some of them have seen the great Paris, the great London, these incredible places, and they don't want to be on the farm in the middle of Kansas. The majority, though, that are coming back It's not about having had these adventures. It's that they've seen destruction in a very different level. Many of them are returning with what is known as shell shock. Very similar to today, what we would diagnose as PTSD, post-traumatic syndrome, stress syndrome. They have seen things that is very difficult to explain to people on the home front, and they don't talk about it. Americans on the home front, all we could see about World War I is it had hurt our men. It had hurt our soldiers. What had we gained from the war? Yes, our economy was booming, but what had we gained? Did we gain any lands? No. Did we win any gold? No. But our men weren't coming back the same. In the meantime, Woodrow Wilson is like, wait a minute, this is a wonderful opportunity to bring peace to the world. I know I have the outline for this. I have a plan. It's my internationalism, he calls it. My internationalism has a vision. It's called the 14 points. And my 14 points are going to make a new world order. Remember, guys, Wilson is a professor. We live up here in La La Lands. And he has these ideas, these 14 points that will never again, he says, bring war. If we follow this plan, we will never have war. And these are his 14 points. Really the key ones I've got in bold. And you know, when you look at these, you can almost kind of group them in certain sets. The first one, for example, an end to secret diplomacy. And what he's saying is we need to be transparent. We need to stop making secret alliances and secret treaties. We need to be transparent to each other. Countries need to be transparent. The second is very, very important to Wilson. Not his most important, but it is important. He's talking about freedom of the seas. And if you look at 2, he's also talking about removal of trade barriers. So what he's talking really here is a freedom to trade with who you want. Not be fearful in the seas, not be fearful of submarines, not be fearful of attacking ships, whether it's peace or war, just to have that freedom to trade. He talks about, very important to him, the next set is a reduction of arms, that we don't need these escalation, these arms races. In fact, the only arms we need are that for domestic security. The other group, really kind of from 5 to 9, have to do with respecting borders, respecting national sovereignty. And if you look at number 11 and number 13 as well, it's really about allowing, at number 10 and 12, I should say, it's about allowing self-determination for these minorities under empires. They should be given their self-determination. He's talking about border respect, restoring borders that have traditionally been there. And then for Wilson, the most important thing, the establishment of a League of Nations. This for Wilson was the most important point of his 14 points. The establishment of the League of Nations was, he wanted to organize an organization where every country sent in representatives, and that in this organization, they could discuss their problems, they could discuss their conflicts, and therefore, hopefully, avoid war. If you think about it, the League of Nations is the precursor to today's United Nations. So Wilson is very excited about his 14 points. He is taking it to the Peace Treaty Conference. Sorry, guys, I had to grab this real quick. The Peace Treaty Conference, remember, the war is just, they're not fighting. It's an armistice. They need a peace treaty to actually officially end the war. And the Peace Treaty Convention is going to be held at Versailles, France. Who is going to put together the peace treaty? Well, the victors of the war. United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy. Italy is now part of the Allies. And the leaders of these 4 countries, which are nicknamed the Big Four, meet to discuss the peace treaty. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Great Britain, Georges Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France, and Vittorio Orlando, Prime Minister of Italy. So they meet in Versailles, France, to discuss how officially will they put together peace and end the war with Germany. Wilson has his 14 points, and the other three look at him and they go, thank you, very good ideas. We love you, US. We couldn't have done this without you. And never is the United States unappreciated. They are seeing the United States as heroes. They are seeing the US as great help. They are manpower, their weaponry, their food, everything that the US has provided is very much respected and appreciated. However, the US was last minute saviors. Great Britain, France, and Italy have been fighting this war since 1914, and in particularly Great Britain and France, they have suffered an incredible amount of loss of life, destruction of lands, destruction of industries. They have lost money, they have lost lives, they have lost years that they will never be able to get, and they want Germany to pay. It is that simple. They want revenge. A lot had been lost, and they want Germany to pay. They want compensation. Wilson is like, well, but wait. And they're like, no, Wilson, thank you. But we're not going to compromise on the fact that Germany has to pay. So when they start ironing out this treaty, yeah, they're going to include some of his points. For Wilson, at least he really, and they're going to tweak him. He's like, this is torture. But he gets his 14th point in there, the way it is. Organization of a League of Nations. And Wilson at least is like, okay, at least I got my baby in there. They didn't tweak that, and it's good. Well, the Treaty of Versailles is, to this day, exactly what they wanted: revenge. It is the most punitive means vengeful, punishing peace treaty. There's the irony in that of pretty much all world history. And I don't think there is one historian that would argue that that treaty is one of the biggest contributors to World War II. Germany obviously had no say in the treaty. They had lost, and they could not become involved in the treaty. Russia no longer exists. The Soviet Union is what is now in place, and the Soviet Union is not consulted at all in this treaty. The Big Four say, you got out of the war, you have no say in the treaty. The Soviet Union remains very angry about this, that they were not consulted, and remains a sore point in dealing with Western Europe and Soviet relations. Anyhow, what are the main points of the Treaty of Versailles? There are many points to the Treaty of Versailles. It isn't just these 5 that I have on here. There are many other points of the Treaty of Versailles, but these are kind of the biggest and most important. To begin with, all German colonies are divided between Great Britain and France. So Germany loses all its colonies. The German borders are completely redone, and they are going to move some lands from Germany and give them to various other countries. The third point of the Treaty of Versailles is that Germany has to accept they started the war. They were the aggressors. By the way, guys, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire is completely dismantled, okay? But Germany, seen as the official aggressor, will have to pay the reparations, the damages of this war, which France and Great Britain say is in the billions. They have to pay it. Finally, as far as Germany is concerned, they are going to totally disarm Germany, which means they are dismantling its army, its navy, and its domestic police force. They are saying no arms in Germany, nothing, zilch, no arms. And yes, we do want peace. So we do believe in the establishment of a League of Nations. Wilson's like, at least we have something there. Guys, World War I is going to have Treaty of Versailles has major repercussions. Germany is completely destroyed with this treaty. Now, I'm not trying to take away whether or not Germany did or didn't start the war. In many ways, it did. It was the aggressor. But this treaty disarms it, economically destroys Germany. What it does is it makes for Germany having to borrow money from banks in Europe to pay these war reparations. They cannot pay back the loans. And what ends up happening, these banks default. In their default, they lead to a bank crisis in Europe, which is going to lead to the World Great Depression. The other issue with Germany is that this total disarmament of Germany wounds it tremendously. It destroys the mentally, morally, spiritually. I mean, they've just gone in there and just devastated Germany. Well, it lays the groundwork. You have these people that are desperate, maybe to hear something special about themselves after they've been completely destroyed by the rest of the world. And someone does. Someone comes in and offers them all kinds of special things, that they are a great people, that they are the heirs and the builders of what will be a Third Reich or a Third Empire, that how dare someone take away from Germany the ability to arm itself. In fact, Germany should have the biggest and the best army and the biggest and the best navy, and begins doing that for them. And there is someone that does that. Charismatic, gets them excited. His name is Adolf Hitler. In many ways, the Treaty of Versailles lays the groundwork for Hitler. Germany is devastated. Borders are rearranged throughout Europe. People are dislocated from their lands, refugees. And over all of this, you have this shadow from the East, the Soviet Union, this communist regime that nobody knows what they will do. We've never had this communist regime, and people are fearful of the communists. We will have our own Red Scare or fear of communism in the US. Wilson returns, and I'm going to go over just a little bit, guys. I'm looking at the time right now. Wilson returns to the US with the Treaty of Versailles and separation of powers. Remember, the president can sign treaties, but the Senate must ratify the treaty to go into effect. So he presents it to the Senate. The Senate says no, they don't ratify it. I mean, it's not even close. Wilson's like, you got to vote on this again. I mean, no. Look at the treaty and get it ratified. We need this done. He then appeals to the American people. He kind of goes on the bully pulpit. He takes a train tour all across the country. He's saying, write your senators. This is a good treaty. Look at this League of Nations. It's going to protect us from war. This League of Nations is the best thing in the world. And Wilson thinks in a way that the Senate and the Americans don't like it because it's so damaging to Germany. He's like, the Americans in the Senate could care less about those things. What they hate about the treaty is the League of Nations. Wilson didn't get it. For Americans, the League of Nations was a way of keeping us involved with Europe. And what we wanted to do was get away from Europe. The war had done nothing for the Americans. This European adventure we had done nothing. It had brought back soldiers that were not adapting well. We were having bumps in our economy as it was returning to a peacetime economy. We were disillusioned. We were saddened. We were like, Washington was right. Why, oh, why did we ever go into World War I? It's just not of any concern to us what happens in Europe. Look at their crazy paintings. We don't need that. And then as our soldiers are returning, people are fighting for jobs. There are racial tensions on the rise. You add to all of this the Red Scare. this fear of, from Europe, communism. Look at the Soviet Union. Look at what happened in the Bolshevik Revolution. Look how they killed a whole family. That's how we see it. We don't want that in the United States. And we start finding communists everywhere. We call them the Reds, the communists. They're everywhere. In 1920, there was a trial, Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian communists, immigrants, again, that European connection, that were involved in a crime. They had actually been involved in a burglary. And in the commitment of that burglary, there was a killing, a death, or at least that was the argument. And so Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted of this murder, and they were actually sentenced to die. The evidence during the trial presented actually kind of showed that they did commit the burglary. They never actually, Sacco and Vanzetti never really denied that. But when the murder happened, there wasn't any evidence that they had done the murder. Actually, they weren't kind of there when it happened. They were still convicted. And it's pretty much argued they were convicted because they were Italian communists. We were scared of everything that Europe seemed to bring, including communism. And then you add that the Attorney General is getting bombs. Attorney General Palmer is getting bombs in the mail. We're starting to have bombs being mailed, and we don't know what's happening. Attorney General Palmer is going to send security forces to raid various warehouses where supposedly these bombs are coming from. And again, they're coming from communist infiltrators. We were just tired of Europe. And if we even got into this League of Nations, most Americans said they're going to drag us into another war. They're going to drag us into their crazy ideas like communism. We don't need this. Wilson doesn't get it. He actually suffers a cerebral hemorrhage. And a lot of people did not realize, but he was not in charge of the country for many months because of the cerebral hemorrhage. It was his wife who was actually passing a lot of orders and executive orders while he was very sick in the White House. The treaty was never ratified. Americans just did not want the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was actually started. We did not participate in it. It isn't until 1921 that the United States will officially end the war with Germany. I have a little typo there. It's Germany, not Germany, and the remnants of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. That empire no longer existed, but with Austria, etc. Now, 1920 is an election year. Americans, we were disillusioned with everything. I mean, we were disillusioned with Europe. We were disillusioned with war. We were tired of everything. And then you just add insult to injury. Baseball gets corrupted. How? There's a scandal in the World Series. The Chicago White Sox had made the World Series. They lost. Okay. But then we find out that White Sox players had been bought out by gamblers. Baseball had been corrupted. That was it. We just wanted to be isolated again. We wanted to return to isolationism. We wanted to return really to normalcy. Everything just seems so crazy to us now. What did Americans do really well? We did business well. We did great at making money. And so that's kind of what Americans wanted to do. We just wanted to go back to what we did best. Get away from Europe, get away from all the craziness. Well, the Republican nominee for the presidency, Warren G. Harding, has as his slogan, "Let's return to normality." Well, I don't really need to tell you this, but Warren G. Harding wins in a landslide the 1920 presidential election. He hit on exactly what the American people wanted. And for good or for bad, the mandate of the people, the vote, the power of the people, the voice was, let's return to what we do best. Make money. Let's forget Europe and let's focus on our normalcy. And our normalcy is business, industry, capitalism. Let's go. And the 1920s begin. We went back to what we do best, making money. And that, guys, I know I went over a little bit, a few minutes, not as much as the other class, but the progressive age is over.